Right. I know it's a little warm down here, but I'm wearing a coat my grandpa made in honor of him. So yeah. Um, oh, I've talked a lot about how storytelling has helped me, heal from my own struggles and find a new place in the world. So I wanted to share a story about my grandma and grandpa, hoping to carry on their story. This is it. When I take long walks under the pine trees that line my street, I always think about my grandma. When the sun would start to set, she'd take me on nature walks as I'd gather falling leaves, twigs, and pebbles in an empty egg carton. She even helped me catch my first silkworm hanging onto a giant maple leaf. Nature connects me not only to my grandmother, but to everything she represents for me. My grandmother and I had amazing memories together. As a child, she'd always yell at me for going barefoot on the cold kitchen tiles. She didn't want me to catch a cold, as she'd say in her thick Czech accent. My grandmother made the most mouth-watering noodle pudding, and every holiday was filled with homemade chicken soup, brisket, and leftovers for weeks. My grandmother was the strongest, most generous woman I've ever known. She was my role model, my hero, and a powerhouse of a lady that connected me to my faith, my legacy, and my home. At 18 years old, my grandmother survived the concentration camps. She once told us the story of the day she was liberated from Auschwitz. As planes flew over their heads, a soldier told her, "You're free." And she didn't really know what that meant. My grandmother was a creative soul in and out of hard times. In the camps, she survived on this creative fuel. The Nazis forced her to sew their uniforms because she was a highly skilled seamstress, which, along with her determined spirit, is how she was able to survive. She and her surviving family members ended up in the German DP camps before they immigrated to America through Ellis Island in 1947, then making their home in New York City. She met my grandfather, a tailor, an immigrant from Poland, on Delancey Street. They married and started a family and built a successful clothing manufacturing business in Brooklyn that made garments for various department stores. Supposedly, Lyndon B. Johnson's daughters wore some of the suits and coats that they made. So now war was over and my grandma was free. But now there were many people who had a really strong dislike for immigrants, and my grandparents were met with hate and disbelief. My grandmother remembered having shoes thrown at her in the street. Nowadays, people talk openly about mental health and psychology, but back then, post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't really a thing. So she just always kept whatever she was feeling inside. Despite what she had been through, my grandmother never grew bitter. I could sense a sadness, but she was always loving, grateful, and generous for as long as I knew her. Growing up, I felt this strong connection with my grandmother, although I didn't understand the depths of her struggles as a young child. She was just grandma. So she and I would take our walks. She would sew buttons on my coat, bake her ridiculously delicious noodle puddings, and hug me so tightly I couldn't breathe. And although she never liked to discuss the pain of what she went through, I could always see that depth in her eyes. My grandmother was faced with these life-altering circumstances at 18. And little did I know I would connect with her struggles so deeply. When I was 18, a week before my high school senior prom, I randomly found myself in intense pain. I woke up from a coma months later, only to learn that my stomach had literally burst to the top of the operating room and exploded. And after both my lungs collapsed and I needed 122 units of blood, I was lucky to still have breath going through my now unrecognizable body. So here I was, suddenly displaced from my former life as a carefree, audacious, musical theater obsessed teen, and thrust into this world of tubes, bags, beeping machines, and a world of crisis where everything became minute to minute, a fight for physical, emotional, and spiritual survival. So I was discharged from the hospital mostly because I was no longer in danger of dying. But I still had no stomach and I still couldn't eat or drink. I missed my old life, my sense of home, my sense of family. Now I was just waiting for life to be like it was or for something to give. The last time I saw my grandparents was the night I was rushed to the OR. Learning they had died in my new post-coma situation was a shock because now I too was in another world. When my parents told me the news, I didn't know what to think. I was too numbed out by surgeries, medical interventions, and the tormenting flashbacks of sexual abuse shortly before my coma to feel anything. Worse, I was home with a refrigerator in the kitchen, but no digestive system, so I just tried to not feel anything at all. Feeling the slightest bit of sadness, loss, or any bit of human emotion might make me feel the deadliest feeling at all: hunger. I didn't want to think of my grandmother. I couldn't bear the weight of her gone from my life. But I needed to feel her as a beacon of hope at a time when hope was extremely hard to find. So I decided I would take the first baby step to mourning my grandmother. I decided to feel, in the desperate attempt to keep any last scrap of hope alive. My mother and I often searched for her spirit in the many seagulls that flew around our tiny house by the water. We would pray to any seagull we saw, feeling my grandmother's presence in their glorious flight. The seagulls helped us believe in miracles, that things would get better, and that my grandmother was still with us, watching over us in her loving protection. It made us feel less afraid of what the uncertain future would bring us at a time when it was hard to keep believing in anything. When my grandmother passed away, I didn't lose that connection. The day I decided to really think of her, mourn my losses, and cry over her legacy, that was the day I was able to slowly incorporate her back into my life. Her spirit stayed with me, and her love guided my way. Her love guided me all the way back to finding myself. My grandma taught me how to care again. She always said that everything was a miracle. The miracle was really learning that she'd been with me all along, watching over me and ensuring that not only did I keep my body alive, but my spirit, my will, and my heart. Now she's the music as I dance, the food that warms my insides, and the guidance into the unknown world of the rest of my life. And every now and then, as I walk outside and look at the same trees that my grandmother would always point to, I sometimes see a seagull soaring over my head. It was her strength that I channeled to get through my own wars. And once I was physically healthy enough, but still struggling to get back to normal, I felt like now I was able to understand her on a deeper level. And that's when I realized that, like her, the emotional pain of what I went through would take a lot longer to heal than physical scars. So to get through the pain, I latched on to my childhood memories of her thick accent, homemade egg noodles, and the fact that she was deathly afraid of water after the long boat ride to America. I started talking to family members to learn as much as I could about her. And the more I learned, the more I felt healed as I understood her. I started a documentary theater project inspired by her story and the strength she gave me to prosper again after my illness. My grandmother has always been my angel, especially in times when I've struggled to have hope. And now her legacy means everything to me. So now, as I continue to mourn her and celebrate her miracles, the tears I cry are of joy, of loss, and a life so well lived and loved. So thank you, Grandma and Grandpa, for guiding me back to myself. Huh? Thank you.